Hello, everyone. We'll just give it a couple of minutes for people to join before we kick off with the webinar today. Great. So I can see, I guess, the numbers coming in. So I mean, thanks everyone for joining today for a Reuters Events webinar as part of our sort of 2021 series of webinars. And it's a pleasure today to be joined by Steve Ross, who is the Data and Digital Business Lead at ORE Catapult. So, I mean, this webinar in particular, we're looking at circular economy for the wind sector. And I mean, we're running for around an hour, and Steve will give a presentation, and then we'll follow up with Q&A. So make sure to get your questions in throughout, and we'll address them for the last sort of 15 to 20 minutes at the end. In, I guess, an open discussion, I'll hand over the questions to Steve that everybody submits. And for those that we don't get to answer, obviously we've got sort of a bit of a time constraint on the hour. So we'll follow up via email with the recordings of the webinar, a PDF of the presentation, and also some further information for anyone to take away, and they're looking to get into contact with Steve himself or anybody in Reuters Events, or also ORE Catapult as well. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Steve. So Steve, take it away.
Thanks, Reese. I'm sure everybody is now very used to these virtual events. So, and I do appreciate that Europe is 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So, on the basis that I want to keep you awake for this conversation, we've got a pretty punchy 35-40 minute sort of PowerPoint presentation, and then hopefully we can get to some fluid questions which we can cover off. So first of all, the first question I think that we're aiming for is, why are we here? And also, why are we even looking at circular economy in a sector within the energy sector that is already defined as being pretty green on the basis that it's got a very low carbon footprint, and the understanding of decarbonisation for it doesn't seem to make a great deal of an argument. But the problem is, it does make a big argument, and there is a big issue with regards to the wind sector at a point whereby we move away from production and we start to move into decommissioning, and what the impacts are for that in relation to the turbines which have been built, the amount of plastics which we're producing. To give you a good touch figure point from that position, over the next 3 to 5 years, some 60,000 tons of plastic will come off of decommissioned wind farms, both on and offshore, excuse me, which are all geared and associated with blades. So there is an issue that needs to be addressed that was not top of the agenda 25, 30 years ago when the sector started to evolve. Within that same context, I think it's important to point out that we in the UK are looking at sort of substantial growth in the offshore wind market. So if you look at this very sort of simplistic path to net zero, and I'll explain why it's simplistic in a moment. It just shows substantial growth leading up to a 75 gigawatt position for just offshore wind. Onshore wind took a bit of a battering over the last few years. That's kind of relaxed a little bit in relation to the last government's position, and onshore wind will actually start to grow. But 75 gig in the UK is huge. When I first got involved with the sector some 18 years ago, when dinosaurs were still roaming the earth, at that point we were looking at aiming to a 2 gig position. Here we are, as I say, 15, 18 years later, and that number is just growing exponentially as we move forward. So it's got massive potential in relation to how the market will start to expand. But within the UK, we're a multi-fuel strategy, and although I have been flying the flag for renewables and wind and offshore wind, for that matter, for some substantial years now, you cannot ignore the fact that the strategy has to be multi-fuel. Wind by its very nature is intermittent, which means that when the wind blows, we do great, but when it doesn't, you have drop-off. Now you can get around that by obviously by having wind farms all around the UK, but there's still a strategy in place which says we need to understand what the run out is going to be for traditional fossil fuels and how renewables can actually start to move into a different space. And by that, I mean hydrogen, and by that, I mean blue and green hydrogen, of how that will be the energy fuel source of the future. Now that in itself brings up a whole series of questions which we seriously do not have time for today, with regards to infrastructure, part technology, vehicles and home use, etc. The transmission of that energy source and how it's stored and how it's managed accordingly. But what I do want to give a bit of a focus on is a piece of work that we did with the OGTC, that's the Oil and Gas Technology Centre, and how we actually started to fit back into that. But first of all, just a little about for those of you that are not aware of offshore renewable Catapult and who we are. I'll just do a couple of slides on that, so just bear with on how we work. We're very much a case of a backed entity with regard to the UK government. Our focus is very much in the sector for offshore renewable energy. By that we mean wind, we mean marine, tidal, some storage activity comes back into that. But we also have got a leading test and demonstration facility, which some of you may be aware of up in Blythe. We have our own turbine, which operates on the Fife Coast, which is a very unique 9 megawatt Samsung turbine, one of the only ones in the world, basically. But we use that as for test and demonstration facilities, and very much a case of making sure that that's available to the sector for testing out equipment and sort of disruptive technologies, etc. We're spread all across the UK. I myself am quite close to Grimsby in Lincolnshire, and that has become a hub very much for O&M activity in the North Sea in relation to renewable energy. So a key position, obviously, from that perspective. We're very involved with the universities. So universities such as Manchester and Strathclyde, and Bristol and Sheffield, where we have good relationships, and also their research hubs. So in other words, we're actively working with the PhDs and the spin-outs that are coming from those universities to move forward. We're also involved with China, and we have a place in Yantai over in China, which is part of the International Research and Innovation Centre. And that's about getting UK businesses into the Chinese market, which, as we all know, is growing exponentially from that perspective. And some little impacts here, excuse me, and these are from last year, so these are already out of date. I quickly apologise. As I say, we support SMEs in the UK, some 235, some 803 since 2013 when we were first formed. And that's businesses which are either looking to get into the sector or have technology whereby they feel they can actually be of benefit to the sector moving forward. But we're not just UK focused, we have a big international focus as well. And again, 63 projects last year. Some nice big uplifts with regards to revenue, about 36%. Huge academic collaborations there, as you can see. And really from the point of view of where we're sitting at the moment, we've become a key element in the offshore renewable space. We have links back into BEIS, which is the Energy Secretariat in the UK. And we influence policy, and we do actually have a key role to play with the way in which the energy sector deals are put together and the premise of the entity works forward. Anyway, enough of the plug. Back to the point I was talking about before about this mix of energy sources. We did some work with, as I said before, the OGTC, and you can actually get a copy of this document as part of the end of this program, which Reece touched on earlier, excuse me. And what it really looked for is ways in which the options are there to deliver a decarbonised UK energy position. So that's looking at a mix of where oil and gas can move to blue and renewables can move to green hydrogen, the role that CCS has to play, that's the carbon capture and storage, and the way in which we can actually start to be in harmonise with the two elements of petrocarbons and also the cleaner energy sources. I think for any of us to actually sort of sit here and say oil is dead and we will never use oil again is a bit naive. Oil has a role to play until we start to change some of those techniques. And I don't just mean for power sources, but also for the way we live our lives. I mean, I'm surrounded by plastic at the moment, as I'm sure you are back at home or in your office. And the viewpoint is that for us to sort of say, cut that dead and to not sort of go any further would be a miss out on the transformation and the understanding of the skills that are available. And more to the point, getting to a position whereby there is an evolution which starts to move forward. And what this reimagining of a net zero for the North Sea, which obviously is the biggest area for energy offshore in the UK, has to do is to look at some of those issues over the next 30 years and how that can actually start to fit back in. Now, obviously, any investment and any change within an energy strategy has a cost, and we need to sort of recognize what that actually starts to mean. Obviously, the turbines are getting bigger. The energy being produced, as I mentioned before, is growing exponentially over those same years. But from that same sort of point of view, if we don't start to look at it from a point of view of a combined energy source, then we miss out on some real potentials of how that can start to fit together. And I picked up some of the highlights here, such as getting that investment. And obviously, this is a play back into UK government of some 416 billion over the next 30 years. Sounds a lot of money, but when you start to break that down against the potential value of what that could start to bring of 125 billion a year for the next 30 to 40 years, then that number becomes a bit of a no-brainer from that perspective. It needs more ratification, it needs more focus. But the key thing within any government position is looking at how that job growth will be. And we see substantial job growth in moving towards a net zero North Sea position over the coming years. The focused investment from the technology and innovation side could also, we believe, deliver a huge saving. We're talking about 154 billion from that point of view. And that's moving towards affordable clean energy. But it's also about sort of tapping into better technology, better understanding, use of robotics, autonomous systems, and the way in which we can actually get British industry to start to become much more focused and help deliver some of those key elements that are there. And I don't just mean companies which are already working in the energy sector. This is also for businesses which are maybe working in automation or maybe working in infrastructure. And they also have a key lead and an opportunity to get involved with how things start to become of benefit. Excuse me, I'm going to cough there. So obviously from that point of view, there is a cost impact for the wind sector and especially offshore in relation to how that can start to move forward, both from a major environmental impact, but also the way in which we start to look at decommissioning as part of that decarbonisation process. So what could it look like? And again, this is explained in great detail. I will not go into huge detail here because we seriously do not have time today. But the way in which this map would start to look and really where our focus would be in relation to the Catapult is maximising the turbine capabilities and then plugging that back into a hydrogen style economy, which starts to decarbonise, starts to become much more effective. A lot of that technology is already there within the LPG sector, is in there in relation to the oil and gas wider sector in relation to drilling technology and rig technology, which could be utilised much more effectively for creating injection facilities for CO2, moving away from the point of view of creating energy storage, which is sea-based, looking at the way in which we create energy hubs which sit offshore and are then pumped back into the network. Now, I know already there'll be 150 questions saying, oh yeah, but what about the infrastructure and how do you pump it? How do you get the position of getting hydrogen back into the economy? What happens at car level or the way in which your fridge will work in the future? All of those questions, I would totally agree, are as and critical from our point of view. the focus of where we are in relation to the Catapult is to look at that first stage of generation and transmission. The other elements which fit back into that, I can guarantee you, are also being reviewed and understood in a much more wider context of other research institutes similar to our own. So we're not talking alone. And I think the other key thing within this, and we found this out by working with the OGTC, is to ensure that there is a wider collaboration, not just within our process to create something which is blinkered and focused only on one element. It needs to understand what the knock-on effects and where the impacts are going to be and the touch points are as a result of pushing for some of these major changes which the sector requires. Again, big chart here, and I'm not going to go through all of this, you'll be pleased to hear, because we will be here all day. But it really gives a three-way position of where the UK government could go. The today position shows that it's already a £40 billion economy. It generates 140,000 jobs. UKCS, that's the United Kingdom Continental Shelf, North Sea. And what the imports are for that. And it's not huge. I mean, we're talking still a good 55% of UK generated input. And the investment is currently 10 billion. And that's coming from industry, that's coming from government, that's coming from the wider resources of what's actually being put back into that environment. And then the blue and the light blue and green areas that you can see to the right of that are really looking at the way of how fast do you want to run. So in other words, the question to government is, if you want to do an emerging process, yes, you can do it, but it gives you a limited amount return. And what I would look at here is the second set of boxes where you've got the energy mix. And you see that position whereby you have offshore wind still starting to grow, but the mix of hydrogen suddenly becomes quite important. Now, obviously, if you do an emerging environment, you're going to end up with blue hydrogen, which is still petrocarbon driven, and not so much in the way of green hydrogen as you would do if you went through the transformational end at the wider end of the spectrum. Same with the oil and gas sector. There is a dependency within oil and gas if you go through the emerging process still, but it becomes less as you start to move forward through the other gears from that perspective, as those sectors start to transition towards hydrogen and become much more of an integrated energy production business. And then finally, the last one you can see down there, which is the carbon capture and storage. And again, that's there, but we see this as the upturned bathtub, or the bellwether model, depending on which part of the pond you're from. And what that means is at the moment, there is very little in relation to carbon capture. There's good understanding, but there's very little in the way in which that has actually been implemented. As we go through an emerging environment, that could probably get up to sort of a more substantive position. But what's actually quite interesting, if you follow that same model, is because there's not such a huge requirement for carbon capture towards the back end, if we went through a radical transformational position, that would actually start to decrease, because you in effect are not producing as much CO2 as you would have been in relation to moving faster to a hydrogen economy. So I'll leave this with you. As I said, all of this documentation you can download. So please do use the links which Reese and his team will supply towards the end of this session. And then really some of the final points here, what would that actually look like? Well, again, where the key touch points that we see it from the point of view of the Catapult is it makes a real bolstered economy. We're talking about 125 billion from the point of view of moving forward in relation to how that could start to move forward. Technology will have an impact from that. And by that, I mean, as I've said before, things like robotics, things like the use of autonomous systems, working offshore in any capacity is an incredibly dangerous environment. So the more we can actually reduce the man time which is going out there and retrain those skills to manage robotics and autonomous systems, it becomes a much more safer environment to actually operate from. We see the thing of cost reduction also as being a key part of how that works, and that fits very much into the continuity. So again, it's all of the key elements about reducing that cost, making it an affordable point of energy production, and also getting to the point whereby there's a continuity across the energy sectors which start to pull the three bits together, oil and gas and renewables. I'd like to be in the position that by 2050, we actually lose the word renewables, because it's a bit like if you were, and you can remember, as I definitely do, back in the turn of the century, and we talked about new media, which in effect is the internet. So we don't talk about new media anymore, it's just media. And I'd love to be in a position whereby renewables is just energy from that perspective. But I said before at the beginning of this session, part of that circular economy process is looking at the way in which the industry starts to looking at decommissioning. Now, I first worked on the construction point for Robin Rigg, which I think was 2011 or 2010. So a good few years ago. It was the first wind farm I actually physically worked on, followed by Ormond. And both of those farms were seen at the time as being state of the art. You know, Ormond, I think, is 30 turbines big. It's 25, I think, at Robin Rigg, 2.53 megawatt machines. And if you actually think about that in relation to where we sit today, all of those, you know, those are round two programs, but the round one development programs, which are heading for 25 years old. So that's sites such as Boba Bank, Teesside, etc., which are quite small and to some extent a bit nearshore, are getting a bit long in the tooth and getting to the point whereby that decommissioning element will come about. Now, we as a sector have got very little understanding about decommissioning. We have relationships with oil and gas who understand decommissioning a lot better, oh, excuse me, albeit in a slightly different context in relation to the type of decommissioning which they go through, such as well capping and ensuring that big sort of infrastructures will actually come about to be done. But within the sector of wind power, that also has a big impact on the basis of there is a school of thought that it's simplistic reverse engineering. I would disagree with that. And the fact that for as much as you would want to do, you leave as much on the seabed or in situ as possible. I would also disagree with that. And I also think there's as much a ecological issue here as much as there about decommissioning. So if we look at a simplistic viewpoint of how decommissioning or how a wind farm is actually structured, at the point of commissioning, 100% is of cost and risk. In other words, that's the point whereby the sector says, or the operator is saying, I'm prepared to take the risk. I understand what my wind resource should be, and I can see where that's going to be coming back into a position of strength in the future. That's my risk quota to effect. So in 8 to 10 years, that construction and installation cost has kind of been recovered. And I say kind of because obviously there's a retrofitting, there's repair processes, there's O&M, which would fit back in there, and you know, lots of other elements that would come in there. But as a rule of thumb, it's 8 to 10 years. So that leaves the last 15 years of your wind turbine to maximize your profit for the asset owner and plan for decommissioning or repowering of how that would start to be. Now, as I mentioned before, some of the round one sites in the UK probably will never be repowered. They were, excuse me, feet in the water, in effect, for a lot of the operators to determine whether they or not they actually wanted to work in that space, whether the risk was big enough, and whether it was a competent long-term plan from that point of view. Obviously, we now know that the sector just keeps growing from that point of view, and that risk has been magnified to a point whereby it makes sense to continue. But as a rule, this is the process it works. The only downside is that decommissioning element, which was negotiated by the operator which took that initial risk, has probably been flipped and turned maybe 2 or 3 times through ownership. And there's a point whereby someone is going to be left holding a bill, which, to be quite frank, is probably dramatically more than was being planned at the point whereby the licensing happened. So decommissioning has got an element of real cost impact in relation to you as an operator. If you're an OFTO and you work in the UK, then that impact is even bigger because you don't have a knock-on cost generator which will overcome some of the decommissioning risk which you're actually going to have to participate in. So there's elements within this which do start to bring things forward and get a focus. We in the UK are probably 3 to 5 years off hitting that third big button for decommissioning, which means now is the time whereby getting a good understanding of what some of those costs and some of those impacts are starts to make more sense. So I apologize, I've actually stolen this from the Catapult Networks guys who were working with, again, on a net zero design and make process. So what does it actually mean in relation to making up a turbine and the elements for decommissioning and creating a circular economy process that would fit behind there to come to fruition. So if we look at the way in which a turbine is built, and this is the kind of the same, this could be a car, it could be a house, it could be anything, but the principles are kind of similar. You start with raw material extraction, materials processing, engineering sub-component manufacturing, the assembly of those components, the assembly of the final product, and then there's some operation and product through life. And then at the very end, you have the 5 R's, which I'm sure your kids have explained how they all work, about refuse, reduce, reuse, recycle, and rot. And all of those key elements become critical in the end-to-end process for net zero. If you then start to look at it in relation to who owns what and who's got that responsibility, that first block you see there is very much about the turbine OEM, the cable manufacturing, the transmission deck manufacturers, the generating companies, etc., and all the sub-elements that would fit within there from the point of view of building a wind farm per se. It's kind of handed over, and I say kind of, to the utility or the investor or the owner-operator at the point of operation and the 5 R's. And the reason for that is because at that point, the ownership has gone, it's been paid for, the service contract or leasing process or whatever else has actually gone through on that point still ends up with the utility to make that decision of how and when to scrap the turbine. The question also then needs to go back to the OEM to say, where is the sustainability in relation to a lot of these elements, both in the point of view of their extraction, the miles it takes to actually produce them up, and creating a much more defined carbon footprint for each element of that turbine, so that by the time you get to the point of decommissioning, there is already a net zero understanding of trying to make that offset or operable in relation to how the sector could actually go forward. So it's not a case, we don't believe, of the OEMs or the manufacturing businesses washing their hands at the point whereby it moves to operations. It more becomes to the point about saying there is a corporate responsibility which goes through all of these elements, which becomes much more focused to say, you know, where do you actually sort of take that line and what are you doing in relation to your own specific business to maximize your net zero position. I won't be making these statements to them. I don't need to. The shareholdings of these companies do that pretty well. And you're already seeing major organizations such as Shell and BP making considerable moves in relation to becoming a net zero business. So I'm pleased to say it is actually moving in that right way. I'll keep my little map there on the top right-hand corner. But if we then start to look at what those materials start to be, within a typical turbine, there's high proportions of carbon fiber, composites, copper, steels, some degree concrete, and plastics. Plastics represents a considerable issue in relation to how a turbine is put together, excuse me, and how it is actually focused to getting to a point whereby it can actually be either reused or get to a position whereby it is not gone to landfill, which is obviously the worst situation possible. There's also a low proportion of materials such as magnets, rare metals, fluids and coolants, obviously, and lead. And this starts to look at the ways in which the cabling is fitting in place. And that takes in much more major issues of the many thousands of miles of strings and export cables which go to make up a wind turbine fleet. So from that perspective, if we looked at that globally, it becomes a major issue in relation to how that works. So that means that you have secondary elements within there, such as, do you actually sort of do the simplistic thing, which would be after 25 years, take the cables up, lift out the piles and leave the seabed in a pristine condition? And that you'd think would make an awful lot of sense, except if you know your physics, cables basically give off a bit of a heat register, which oyster and mussel beds particularly like. So over 25 years, they become populated to that degree. If you turn that off, you reduce the ecological impact, and therefore it becomes an issue from that perspective. So it's not just about the recyclates that are involved or the technology. There is an ETA element in here, which also needs to be understood much more effectively and done by the operator at the point of decommissioning. So earlier this year, we put together a program called, sorry, earlier last year, what I'm talking about, called CUES, which is the circular economy for the wind sector. And what we've started to do is look at 4 key areas in relation to what would mean for decommissioning and how that would work, and creating a much more circular economy from the point of view of a catapult. So we do not by any means profess to have all the answers in relation to this. What we are saying is we're starting at a position whereby we expect these issues to be much more focused with regard to an operator. So it starts with cost strategy. So what that means is, and I'll use that as an example in just a moment, but it's looking at it from the point of view, if we were to decommission tomorrow, what would that be in relation to costs? What would the true cost of decommissioning be if based on today's money? And what would be the key elements that you would need to focus on to start to reduce some of those areas down to the point whereby you move forward? End-of-life monopiles. Again, we view monopiles as having a 25-year sort of life expectancy. And we'd like to do a lot more research in relation to that to define what is the true end-of-life position for a monopile. Anything that sits under the seabed, in a pile of sand over 25 years has got all sorts of major issues, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. But from that point of view, it's about really getting to the grips of it to a point whereby we understand exactly what is happening to a monopile, where the stresses are, where the impacts are, and how that can start to work. Recycling and route mapping, we're working with companies such as Zero Waste Scotland, who are very proactive in relation to recycling, obviously. And I've got an exceptionally good team about being able to create a positive route map from the point of either construction or from the point of view of decommissioning, which enables that whole element to say you can actually trace a mineral from its mine to its 3rd, 4th use somewhere down the track from that perspective. Something which is kind of important from that point. And then in the future, a repowering strategy. So once you've actually got to this point, it's being able to evaluate whether you actually do have a site which is worth repowering, what can actually be left behind, what needs to be reinvested, and what can actually be used within that. We'll be using our own turbine, as I mentioned before, up in Scotland, as part of that repowering strategy, and as part of the wider decommissioning point. At some point, that turbine will come down. And from that point of view, we want to use that as being a live example of how that works. And then just a quick touch on the involvement. Obviously, the asset owners and managers, that's a global position from that perspective. The OEMs are involved. Governments with a plural, although very much a case of UK government is backing this through the Crown Estate, Ofgem and others. There is very much a case of interest from other governments around the world, such as the Danes and the Dutch, which is great news. Collaboration, I mentioned that before, but collaboration to us is important. We do not profess to have or will have all the answers. And there are so many other programs going off around the world that what we want to do is to make sure we're not duplicating effort, we're not in a position whereby we are dictating the process. So by working with companies such as Wind Europe, NREL, a program called Zebra, which some of you will be aware of, Suswin and ICA over in Netherlands, the point is to make sure that we are engaged with all of them. We did a bit of desktop research on blade recycling, for example, over the last few weeks. And what we found was there are currently over 3,000 different programs around decommissioning and recycling for the wind sector. Now, we don't intend to be involved with all of those, but we will be involved with a large percentage of those. And where we feel that what that organisation is doing exceeds what we're up to, and Suswind is a very good example of that, we will stop at a point whereby we will enable them to develop the blade of the future much more effectively than we could. Integration with the oil and gas sector, again, we see that as absolutely being critical to that. OGTC are also part of the QS program, as is the Oil and Gas Authority and Oil and Gas UK. And we see that what's happened over the last 10, 15 years within the decommissioning for oil and gas may have some opportunities to cross over into the world of wind. So that, again, to us is a key sort of shortcut learning process for us to start to bring down some of those key costs within that. Solution providers, that's people like the Lloyd Register, that's people like Arup, and many others that are also keen to get involved with that. They're keen to participate. It is industry funded, as I think I've touched on before, and represents around about a 2 million budget for activity we'll do. We have got some funding from UK government, but we would look, as the program develops, to expand that to the wider market. So I just wanted to pick up on one of those, which, and this is just a thumbnail, so there's a lot more detail obviously sitting behind this, but it gives an indication of the type of projects that we're involved with, where the focus would be and how that would work. And as I said before, within the cost strategy, it's very much a case of understanding about the bond that is lodged with BEIS, that's the UK government's energy division, and understanding that cost of decommissioning, what it would actually stand for, and how that could be utilised in relation to the programmes for 2020-21 and extrapolated through to 2025 and up to 2050. So the key point within that is to say, once we understand what that structure actually is, it then gives us a focal point to say, okay, what are the big meaty bits that seem to kind of make sense and how that starts to work. So phase one, which we've kind of done, agreement from the group of the structure of the program. Phase two is into the research, and we've started that with ourselves and academia to actually start to get that cost understanding moving forward. As we come out of phase two, that should be done around about the summer, we start to go into that detailed understanding and the key costs which are associated with it. And what's quite interesting is if you see the images on the right-hand side there, it's kind of the old and the new. The top picture is the decommissioning of the offshore wind farm at Blythe, where we have a big testing environment rig. And then the picture beneath that is the 110-metre blade for the Haliad coming in to be tested inside the shed, which you can see next to it there. So very much a case of, where we sit within the Catapult is, as much as we're involved with the next generation of turbines that are coming forward, we need to have that pragmatic view in relation to what's coming out of the water as well. So my final slide, and I was asked this morning when I was talking to one of my colleagues about, so as I'm an elder statesman of the business, shall we say, and I found that a bit of an insult, but I can cope with that. What did I think 2050 would look like? And again, I think within that, a lot of it has to do with decarbonisation and the zero economy, and making sure that there is a circular process that starts to make sense. So I would say that CEOs in the C-suite are already benefiting from everything that we are talking about now, because a lot of the work will have been done by the time 2050 comes along, and they will have a different perception and a different understanding of how the sector works. Their margins will be different, their costs will be different, and how they sell and produce energy will also be very, very different to what it is today. But that is all to do with the way in which we move away from a petrocarbon energy-focused business to something which is much more cleaner in relation to hydrogen. The energy sector in the UK will, I think, have a very large percentage of the roadmap. In other words, I think we would have already got to the point of the plan that I went through earlier of how that will fit. Whether it's the one which is the most fast-tracked or not is a question of government debate. I would hope it would be. And it's also about industry appetite, how that starts to pick things up. Graduate engineers, and again, I'm a big proponent of the next generation. As I say here, will understand sustainability, decarbonisation, but also digital and data, and that's very much where I come from. But they wouldn't have learned that at university. They learned that at high school. That will just become part of the way in which the kids of the future will just get this stuff. So it's very much a case of it becomes part of that cultural piece before they even get to uni. We'll be building energy plants which are very different to where we are today, and also creating sustainable elements within there and techniques which kind of make sense. So the day of concrete is probably gone, and the way in which we use plastics is going to evolve and change quite considerably. But we will end up with different processes and ways in which we build energy plants of the future, including wind turbines for that matter. The infrastructure and end use will, and again, I did mention before, that is an even bigger story, but they will be benefiting from the science and I think cheaper and wider use of energy. So it's also quite interesting, I think, in these COVID times where here we are sort of in the UK and we have a very good sort of vaccination process, but with the rest of the world trying to catch up, and by that I mean the further you come out of the West and you move into sort of a much more deeper economy, those countries will, I also believe, start to benefit from the use of energy to the point whereby it becomes more effective. Hydrogen, for my bet, will be the view of the energy source of choice. So you can only, I think, sometime in the future see coal, lithium, and high CO2 gas in a museum. It's that sort of situation whereby we will be moving in the next 30 years to a radical change within the energy sector, and one that I believe is definitely for the good. So that's me. Thank you for I think we've done 45 minutes, which is not bad. So thank you for listening. I do appreciate this. This is incredibly hard at the best of times to keep that focus. If there are any questions, either now or if you wish to, please get in touch with me in the future. My details are on the slide here. This deck will be available, as Reese mentioned. So Reese, any questions?
Thanks, Steve. Yep. Thanks for that presentation. We've got quite a number of questions coming in, so please keep them coming as well. But a few of them sort of intertwine with each other, so I think we'll probably start off with them. So John asks, to what extent do you think that there'll be early decommissioning? So he's specifically mentioning onshore in Germany. They see early decommissioning or renewal strategies with technical development increasing significantly. So I guess what extent do you think there will be early decommissioning?
It's happening. I mean, you know, I think onshore is ahead of the curve by lots of ways. Obviously, offshore brings its own problems, which are more endemic. You've got a cable in a subsea environment, but no, I believe that the way in which that's moving is quite critical. We had a long conversation with NREL a couple of weeks ago, which was talking about the US onshore decommissioning plan, and some of those turbines go back to the mid 80s. So from their perspective, they're looking at ways in which they can avoid landfill. They're looking at ways in which the key components, where possible, can actually be reused. So turbines, bearings, all the key components in there, and the firmware. And getting to the point whereby the investment in the US, I think through 4 companies, including DuPont, who are starting to look at ways in which fiberglass can be graded. So I'm not by any means a fiberglass specialist, but part of that discussion looks at the way in which fiberglass is used in the aerospace industry, for example, as a high-grade element, and then starts to filter down and can be reused accordingly within that process. A lot of the key blades, for example, I know there's a big push for bicycle racks, which is quite an unusual way of a blade, very big bicycle rack. But again, I think some of that thinking will start to come out. There has to be a way in which we avoid landfill, and we avoid just treating it as refuse. It cannot be done that way. There is just too much of it, from my personal soapbox.
No, Makes sense, and I think that sort of leads on to what James was asking. He's saying in improving decommissioning capabilities for offshore. Should the strategy, in your opinion, start now, obviously with onshore, and systematically work through the BOMs, which I think that's bill of materials,
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
to develop and validate processes capable for offshore. Basically,
Yeah.
I guess looking at onshore
Yeah.
and scaling
Uh,
up.
uh, absolutely. Yeah, John, you're spot on. I think from the point of view of where we are, a turbine is a turbine, a turbine. And so if we have processes now whereby we can, the way in we deconstruct is built to a point whereby it's safe, it's ecologically sound, and it has a point whereby it can actually has a reuse element within there. Fantastic. And if that can be transferred to the offshore sector as well, even better. So we've done some work with DNVGL and also with Natural Power, who've done similar sort of programs of trying to create best practice for onshore wind. And we've looked at those in ways in which we can actually adopt it for an offshore environment. Because it's in the sea, there are, you need a vessel, so there are always going to be issues which are different in relation to offshore. But there are some key fundamentals within that, which I still believe at the point whereby you get it back to a dock environment, what do you do with it becomes just as valid as it would be for onshore. So yeah, definitely joined up thinking there, definitely required.
Great. And Aaron goes on to mention, do you know if there, I guess, obviously this is a big consideration, but in terms of offshore, is there a reserve of, I guess, money to cover the costs now, like looking in the future to sort of mitigate any escalation in costs as well?
No. And again, that's part of the reason why we're doing the work, is because the way it works at the moment is if you were the operator that took out a license or an agreement to build, you lodge that money with your government to cover that decommissioning element.
Okay.
Before, the big issue you have is that if you look at the way in which the sector works, the company which actually starts with the commission process, in other words, they get the license to build, normally go and sell that on to a venture capital company or a third party. It may well become sort of a merger process which comes along. And that means that by the time you get to the point of decommissioning, you could be 4 or 5 owners down.
Yeah,
and
of course.
that element of cash still remains the same. So if you think about what you were doing 25 years ago and someone said, okay, to knock down your house, how much do you think it's going to cost you? And you say, right, okay, I think I'll knock my house down for £20,000. Right, great. There's £20,000. And here we are 25 years later, and you get built around to say, knock my house down. He goes, yeah, it's 48,000. And there is that scary sort of scenario that a lot of the operators are in, and that the oil and gas sector has gone through in relation to that same debate, basically.
Yeah, makes sense. I guess knowledge sharing, like you mentioned in the presentation, from other sectors is definite benefit. James asks that I think in the presentation there were some percentages on UK content in expanding the renewables economy, but he was asking how much of this was original equipment manufacturing, and does this transformation require the UK to develop and think entirely differently about manufacturing or remanufacturing the supply chain?
Yeah, James, I would totally agree. I think we've missed the trick basically in this country for manufacturing. And again, I also would say that the failing of the government, and I don't mean the Conservative, I mean just any government that looks at it, we've got this kind of blinkered view that the value of O&M and the value of ongoing management of wind farms is not as valuable as a manufacturing plant. So I would say we need to have a different focus in relation to not just the wind sector, but the whole of the dual fuel process, which I mentioned before, in relation to the way in which we build electrolyzers, the way in which we build energy hubs, the way in which we really start to invest in that and get some proper planning and investment by government and the industry to say this kind of makes sense and it should be a British innovation. We've got skills here. We've definitely got capability. There is a ton of interest in relation to a hydrogen economy, not just in the energy production and transmission side, but also, as I mentioned before, in the infrastructure. And I think part of the government needs to sort of recognise that as being a way in which the sector needs to move forward and get behind it in relation to making it easier for manufacturing and the management of those systems to go forward.
Okay, definitely. I mean, I think this leads on perfectly, but it's quite a tough question. But I guess you're mentioning the manufacturing side, but what sort of policies or regulatory changes would you like to see to be introduced to improve the decommissioning process? Appreciate that's a tough one. That.
Yeah, exactly. I need to keep my Catapult hat on here. I think what I would like to do is to see a consensus by the sector to recognise three things. One is the validity of understanding what decommissioning is from a health and safety perspective, and also from a reality check in relation to costs. That's the first thing. Second thing I'd like them to do is to get to a point whereby there is agreement, whether you're an off-tow, whether you're an operator, whether you're an asset manager or an owner, to say, what is the beginning and end? In other words, get to the point whereby, do you lift the cables? Do you leave the pilings? Those key elements. Top side is pretty straightforward. It is and it isn't sort of reverse engineering in effect. As soon as you get into the subsea environment, that's where the big nutty questions start to arise. But that also then comes into, at the same time as looking at your cost impact and your risk, look at the point about saying that repowering point. As I said before, the round one sites, I think very few of those will actually be repowered. But as we go into round 2, round 3, round 4, yeah, they are going to be repowered to some extent. So start to get to that point earlier on that says the policy is not necessarily about you will do this or you won't do that, but what can you do now in relation to the current infrastructure that could change to enable it to be more sustainable and enable it to create a much more sort of zero waste impact.
Great.
I think I dodged that quite well, Reece, actually. So.
I dodged that one, but in style. So I've just distracted myself from what I'd lined up next, but bear with me. Sorry, there we go. So Derek asks, I mean, you concentrated on offshore wind and obviously considering onshore decommissioning as well, but what are your thoughts about tidal in the mix, and do you see it as a key contributor, and what would the comparative benefits be versus wind when we're talking about decommissioning?
Yeah, seriously, tidal is still in its infancy, and I don't know why tidal's in its infancy, but the appetite, I think, for tidal is just not there yet at the moment from an investor and from an operator perspective. On the basis that we live on an island, we have got huge potential for tidal wind, which my colleagues that work in that area would definitely sort of profess to move forward on. So I think it's as important because it's a relatively excuse me, because it's a relatively development sector. Now is the time, I think, whereby it should start to think about the sustainability of what goes in the water and making it to a point whereby there's some future proofing in relation to that technology, which says at the point whereby you decommission, if we're talking barrier, for example, whereby you have a whole array of turbines built in a barrier format. If we are going to go down that route, that technology needs to start thinking about now about how the long-term impacts are going to be in relation to when you do take it out of the water in, again, 25, 30 years' time. So the principles from BEIS or from any government that will look at tidal or marine will be exactly the same. It will still be a case of you lodge your cash for decommissioning to be paid at some time in the future. But if a lot of that work is done as part of the development and build structure right at the early stage, you can learn a huge amount of lessons from the wind sector and the oil and gas sector, and not have that same impact as that comes along in a few years' time.
Great, great. And you mentioned bays there. Colin was curious to see if the Catapult are working with the national grid and bays in regards to development for the offshore grid network.
Yeah.
And if you have
So
details on sort of, I guess, timelines and stuff like that.
yeah, so that's an ongoing development. We have got a great relationship with National Grid and looking at smart gridding from that perspective, and obviously CCUS, the carbon storage element within that comes part of that process. So there is a timeline for that. It does fit into the it doesn't fit into the current sector deal, which has got a couple of years to run yet, but it will start to have that impact as we go into it. And part of the document that I touched on at the beginning of this presentation does start to look at grid networks and how that starts to fit back into it. There's a lot more work to be done there, and if you were to, if you're an electrician and you understand your physics, you probably see sort of similarity to Westinghouse and Edison from our current grid structure. It needs a major overhaul. It needs to become smarter in the way in which it's used. It needs to become much more effective in relation to balancing and load management than it's ever been done before. That is happening, but it's being done on a piecemeal basis, which I'm sure the National Grid would, obviously be agreement with. So there's some major investment needed in the grid network to maximize that. That will also come into effect in relation to what you do with hydrogen, and that might be an adaptation for the gas pipelines, for example, to pipe hydrogen around the country, but not necessarily in a true grid network, but maybe in a regional sub basis to make that much more effective and pump the hydrogen where it's actually required, rather than it's just the case of the whole country's needs a light bulb. Is a slightly different element in relation to that.
Definitely, I think as you sort of mentioned as well in the presentation throughout, when we start bringing hydrogen into the conversation, the conversation just expands.
It does, yeah, all day for that, yeah.
But I guess looking sort of the decommissioning and circular economy angle. So, which utilities are taking decommissioning and circular economy seriously already?
Yeah, well, I think if you look at the companies such as Equinor, who do seem to understand this and are adapting in relation to that. Ørsted, most certainly, in relation to some of their activity. I know it's Alpha Ventus in the Netherlands, which I think is Shell, is also starting to look at creating that as a hydrogen platform from that point of view. So there are starting to see pockets of the major utilities starting to take an interest in that. I will promise you, Reese, it will be on everybody's agenda. No utility in the country, in the world, will not have hydrogen as part of that discussion. It's about where they come in and at what touch point they start to lift the mantle in relation to that. That's the key bit. But it will happen. And I think the programs that we're working on, Carbon Trust and others are also working on, will start to drive that quite effectively. Definitely.
It's good to hear. And I mean, I guess probably one last question to wrap up. I know you sort of went through it on your final slide, but where will the key fundamental changes happen, do you think? So I guess across generation, transmission, or end users, what are your perspectives?
I think mindset is the major transformation piece. It has to come from the point of view that the utilities, government, and organizations like ours, and the disruptors out there, the companies which have got that really cool idea that's going to make a major impact, getting all of those together and starting to deliver something which says, hey, we can do this. This does actually start to make sense. It's proper joined up thinking. It's not just done in isolation. That's really where I think the key fundamentals will start to happen. Part of our job is to do that. I mean, we facilitate a lot of opportunities whereby SMEs and corporates can talk on the same table with the same objective, but it needs to be wider than that, than even what we do, and we do recognise that to get some major buy-in for programs such as the major transformation of the North Sea.
Great. Well, I think we've reached an hour, but that was great roundup there. So, Steve, thanks again for participating. It was
My
great
pleasure. Thank you.
to have you join us today. And everybody, thanks for attending. So we'll follow up with the recordings and more information you can check out in terms of what Reuters events renewables are running for the rest of 2021. In particular for I guess this community, we've got a wind operations summit and an offshore wind summit that's more focused on development in May and September. So look out for more info on that. And also, obviously, the work that Steve and his team are doing, we'll provide some links and contacts in the follow-up. So you can reach out. I'm sure Steve will be interested to hear any comments or, I guess, collaboration.
Absolutely.
But yeah, thanks again for joining, and Steve, thanks again for speaking today.
My pleasure. Thank you all.
Great. Thanks, everyone.